Today we're going to be talking about 3 signs that it's time for you to speak up.
Are you a Catholic wife grappling with challenging in-laws? The Catholic Wives Desiring Peace podcast is your sanctuary for navigating the sometimes stormy seas of life with in-laws while being validated for what you've experienced. Join me, your host, Miriam Susan, a Catholic wife who's weathered nearly 3 decades of in-law drama, as we tackle the tough issues you're dealing with head on.
Hello, Miriam Susan here. Today we're going to be talking about 3 signs that it's really time for you to speak up. Now, what are you speaking up about? Well, since my podcast is for Catholic wives who have toxic, demanding, challenging in-laws, I'm talking about when it's time to speak up about what you're seeing and what you are feeling in regards to the dysfunction, the dynamic that you see with your in-laws. I do want to make one thing clear before I get into the 3 signs that it's time for you to speak up. I am not a psychologist. I'm not a counselor. I'm not a trained therapist. I'm not your pastor. I'm not any specific mental health professional. I'm just a Catholic wife like you who has been part of a dysfunctional extended family for nearly 3 decades, and I'm just sharing my experience and how I have seen things play out with other women. And so going into this, it's not a defined criteria, okay? These are just my observations. Take them for what they are. So the very first sign that I think is a reason that you should stand up is if you see your children suffering. So what does that mean? What is a way that you might see your children suffering? Well, if your children start to get anxious before, during, or even after a visit with your in-laws, if you see them starting to act in a decidedly different way, and that way is negative. Now, my kids get super excited when they get to go see extended family, and so excitement is different. If you see them becoming withdrawn, if you see them seeming more anxious, they're starting to exhibit some anxious behavior, maybe acting out, biting fingernails, pulling hair, having a shorter temper than normal, that's a sign that the tension with your in-laws is starting to affect your kids. Now, I will say that we didn't really see a lot of signs that my in-laws were affecting my kids when they were very little. They loved spending time with their grandparents. They loved spending time with extended family. And we didn't really start to see any of those signs until the kids started to get older, until our kids started to reach the age where it seemed like my in-laws didn't find them so cute anymore. They would start to get stressed out. They would start to be grumpy about the upcoming visit. They would be more shy and withdrawn during visits. I would see expressions on their faces that were of frustration or just being uncomfortable. That was a big, big thing for my older girls when their grandparents would come to visit, because they would get asked some kind of uncomfortable questions. And that would be a sign, and we started to take it as a sign that it was time to speak up. And like I said, when they were little, it was not something that we noticed. So if you have young children and your in-laws tend to be super sweet, super over the top nice, super over the top generous, super over the top fun, then your kids are probably not going to be exhibiting any negative signs after being around your in-laws. So keeping that in mind, any kind of visit can elicit positive or negative reactions. And just because you have one visit where your kids are acting a little grumpy doesn't mean that that's necessarily a sign that you need to speak up. If you see a pattern, if you see it happening every time they visit, that's when the little red flag should go off in your head to think, okay, maybe the visits with my in-laws are starting to negatively affect our children. Number 2, another sign that you should speak up when it comes to toxic, demanding, controlling behavior from your in-laws is when it starts to affect your marriage. If you and your husband are seemingly constantly at odds over visits with your in-laws, over them coming over going to see them, how long you're going to spend time with them, where you're going to stay, what you're going to do, if you're constantly butting heads about it, that should be a signal that something's not right and it needs to be addressed. How you address it with your husband is a very delicate matter because these are his parents. And chances are, if you're arguing over seeing his parents, it's because he wants to see them. So I wouldn't just come out with guns ablaze and try to demand that you're not going to see them or cut off contact. But what you do need to do is think about ways that you can talk with your husband about what's going on, just to make him aware that maybe the things that you see are things that he doesn't see. One of the things that my husband and I experienced when it came to his parents and visiting them and seeing them was a definite difference in how we saw the visits overall. My husband had a very strong sense of obligation to see his parents about every season, so 4 times a year. And I didn't, to be quite honest. We did grow up in a very different culture. Parents lived within a couple hours of his grandparents his entire childhood. I had one grandparent that lived with our family under the same roof, and then my dad's parents lived in West Virginia, and I grew up in South Florida. So we didn't see those grandparents, but maybe once every couple years. And sometimes it was even longer than that. Coming into our marriage, that was a very different expectation that we each had. My husband's expectation was that our kids would grow up spending a lot of time with their grandparents. On his side, that we would spend lots of vacations together, visit them anytime we could, whereas I grew up rarely seeing my grandparents, at least not my grandmother that lived in the house with us, that I didn't expect to see them but once every few years. So that in itself was a challenge to overcome. But when we were getting together with his parents, there were stresses that would come out. He would tend to default to entertaining his parents and kind of pushing everybody else aside, not intentionally, but he just felt an obligation to spend as much time with them. And sometimes a result of that was that the kids didn't get as much attention as they normally would. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Another thing was that we would fight or nitpick or just have little arguments that we didn't really have, except around the time when his parents were visiting. There were times when we would visit and he would maybe go off on a hunting trip with his dad and leave me alone at the house with his mom and the kids. And I felt very uncomfortable. And so that was a source of tension because I didn't like being left alone with his mom. I felt like I had to be on all the time. That's not my personality. I'm very introverted and I didn't like having to feel like I had to be her entertainment and watch the kids the entire time, and it was exhausting. Now, on the flip side, my husband and I have always had a very good relationship with my mom and dad. My dad has since passed, but we have a good relationship with my mom, and going to see my mom and dad never felt stressful, never felt like any kind of obligation. We never felt any kind of pressure when we were there to do certain things, for the kids to do certain things. It was just a relaxing visit. And what's interesting is that when my husband and I lived within an hour of my in-laws, we were about 15 minutes away from my husband's paternal grandparents. And going to visit them was just like seeing my mom and dad. It was relaxed. It was no pressure. It was carefree. It was light. Conversations were easy. It was fun. So the tension was only around seeing my husband's parents. And the same thing went for my husband's maternal grandparents. We would see them after we moved back down to Florida. They had a winter home down there, and we would go visit them, and it was the same thing. It was just drop by when you can, no pressure, we'll get pizza for lunch. Every time we would go, my husband's granddaddy would go shopping, and he would buy the kids Oreos and orange slices, those gummy candies that have sugar on the outside that are so terrible for you, and he'd buy circus peanuts. And he would always have some kind of treat for the kids, and it was light, and it was fun, and it was carefree. And so it wasn't my husband's whole extended family. It was just his parents. So that's a kind of a red flag. If just your in-laws really stress you out, and it might actually extend into, aunts and uncles or grandparents too, if there's dysfunction that has gone on for more than one generation. But if not, if you're like me and you had great relationships with everybody else except the in-laws, that's a sign that something is off. That's a sign in your marriage. If you're stressing out over just seeing the in-laws, that might be a sign that you need to speak up. The final sign that I want to point out today is with you. What do you feel when you think about seeing your in-laws? When you know a visit is coming, when you know you have to go see them, they're coming to see you, all the planning going into it. And even for me, I would start to get stressed out after the visit was over, knowing that the time just reset and the clock was ticking before another visit had to happen. I started to experience chronic fatigue, and part of it I know was due to issues that started way before I even got to know my in-laws. But they didn't get better. They didn't improve. And the tension and the stress that I would feel before visits would manifest in headaches. It would be nervous butterflies. It would be adrenal fatigue, where I was just in a fog. I would have adrenal crashes where after they would leave, because my adrenaline was so high from the visit, having to be on and entertain them and feel like I had to be carefully watching the children and watching what I say and watching what they say. It started to affect my health. If any relationship starts to affect your health negatively, your physical health and your mental health, that's a red flag. So if you do experience things like bouts of anxiety at the thought of your in-laws coming over, if you start to get nauseous, butterflies, migraines, or just headaches, feeling snappy and grumpy because they're coming, it's not all in your head. It's not all in your head. There were times before my husband really understood how toxic things were that he did think that some of my symptoms were in my head. And I think part of that is how he was raised. His mom is a very tough woman in the sense that She had lots of physical health issues that I won't disclose, and she just kind of suffered through it with a smile. And it became an example to my husband that you just suck it up no matter how bad the pain is, and you just keep going. Well, that doesn't work for me. So when I started having more alarming health issues, that was a red flag for my husband that he finally acknowledged was not all in my head. The things that were stressing me out mentally started to develop and manifest physically in my body, and it got to the point where he couldn't ignore it. And that's when he stood up and asked his parents not to contact us. There's a really interesting book. I have to confess, I have not read it. I believe my husband has read some of it, and it's a book called The Body Keeps Score. And if you are experiencing symptoms that really only come around when your in-laws come around, it might be an interesting book for you to pick up and read. I will put the title in the show notes so you can look it up and check it out. But I've had a lot of people recommend that book. A lot of people say that it brings a lot of insight into how our bodies hold on to trauma and traumatic events. And it might help you understand what's going on physically when you start to get anxious about being around your in-laws. So let me just recap what we covered today. Number one, if you see these signs, it might be time to speak up. And the first one I mentioned was signs in your kids. If you see signs of anxiety, acting out, depression, just a general change in behavior for the negative, I would consider that a sign to speak up and look a little deeper into what's going on. The second one I mentioned was if you see signs in your marriage, if you see that you and your husband are more on edge, if you're picking fights with one another, if there's just a general tension between you surrounding visits with his family, I would be a little concerned about that. Family visits are not across the board a stressful thing. They're not. For some people, it has become normal, but it's not a normal thing. Like I compared and contrast visiting with my in-laws versus visiting with my parents. My husband would say the same thing. It's not a matter of in-laws versus your own parents. It was stressful for him to see his parents too, but it was relaxed and easy to see my parents. And it was relaxed and easy to see my husband's grandparents. And then finally, pay attention to the signs that your body is giving you, that this relationship is not quite healthy for you, and start to explore what's going on. Look at the signs that your body is telling you. Our bodies talk to us. I know it seems kind of weird and it's not very common to talk about when it comes to, modern Western medicine, but our bodies give us signals all the time. If your heart starts racing and you start to feel butterflies and you start to feel nauseous, chances are it's not just in your head. We don't try to do stuff like that. Most normal people do not force themselves or cause themselves to have these kind of feelings without some kind of spark, something that causes it to happen. So if you are experiencing some of those things, definitely take some time to explore what's going on. See if it's just with your in-laws or if it's just an overall thing. Maybe you're just overwhelmed and really stressed out, and your in-laws are just the icing on the cake. And that could be it as well. We can't always pin everything on our in-laws, but sometimes they are the cause because of how we feel when we're around them. If we feel like we have to constantly walk on eggshells, if we feel like we can't be ourselves, if we feel like we have to monitor the kids because the kids get on their nerves and the kids can't be themselves, those are some things to take a look at. So if you have any of those signs, please do take some time to pray about it. Ask God to help you see what's really going on. Ask the Lord to reveal to you what the source is of this issue that you're seeing with your kids, with your marriage, with yourself, so that you're not just pinning all the blame on your in-laws. Really take some time to self-reflect, see if you're seeing things where there's not, but if there is something there, I would really encourage you to pray about how and when to find the time to speak up. Thanks so much for tuning in this week. I hope it has been informative for you, and I hope that you have a fantastic week. Go in peace. Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of the Catholic Wives Desiring Peace podcast. I have a free gift for you that I would love for you to get. It is my free scripts for toxic in-laws. It's a little PDF that you can use to give you some examples of how to speak to your in-laws about certain issues. I'd love to give it to you absolutely free. So if you head to desiringpeace.com/gift, it will be there waiting for you. Just enter your name and email so you can start using it for inspiration on how to talk with your toxic in-laws. Again, thanks so much for tuning in. Go to desiringpeace.com/gift to claim your gift now. Disclaimer. All content and information on this podcast and our website, including our programs, products, and or services, is for information and educational purposes only and does not constitute professional medical, psychiatric, or mental health advice of any kind, and does not establish any kind of professional client relationship by your listening to this podcast or use of my website. A professional client relationship with you is only formed after we have expressly entered into a written agreement with you that you have signed, including our fee structure and other terms to work with you in a specific matter. Although we strive to provide accurate general information, the information presented here is not a substitute for any kind of professional advice, and you should not rely solely on this information. Always consult a professional in the area for your particular needs and circumstances prior to making any professional, medical, or mental health related decisions.